Okay, our next speaker is Bruce Clemens. Bruce is a professor of materials science and engineering here at Stanford University and was one of the integral people in organizing this event and helping us pull it together.
Yes, this is normally where I would thank the organizers for inviting me, but since I was so crass as to not actually, the title for my talk was going to be, darn, I couldn't find anyone else to take this slot, but that was rejected, so I hope you bear with me. I'm going to talk today a little bit about from the faculty perspective. So I'm going to talk a little about, start with what is changing and why. And luckily for you, Victoria has already covered a lot of this ground in a lot more inspiring way than I would have, so I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. But in February, we all know the OSTP issued a memo mandating the open access to federally funded data. And the federal agencies are to respond in August. So this is one of the reasons why we wanted to move quickly for this conference to get people up to speed and to get ideas shared before everything hit us from out of the blue. Although, as Victoria said, it's not completely out of the blue. The goal is to promote innovation and technological development through maximizing the distribution of scientific results. So what are the implications for researchers? And one thing I want to bring up is that so far a lot of the dialogue has involved publishers, government offices and agencies, industry, and professional societies, and all of which have their own interests, and none of which solely represent the interest of academic researchers. So I think it's important to take a look at this from the viewpoint of an academic researcher, which is what I'm trying to do here. So the OSTP memo mandates that we, and this is the data part of it, should be stored and publicly accessible to search, retrieve, and analyze. So data, it defines data in the memo. And it does so in a refreshing way in that it lists several things that it doesn't include. But it also refers to, in the memo, it refers to an OMB Circular A110, in which it says data is defined. And so I looked up the memo and looked up how they define data, and it's also a refreshing definition in that it excludes a lot of things from what it means as data. So research data is defined as recorded factual material commonly accepted by the scientific community as necessary to validate research finding, but not any of the following: preliminary analyses, drafts of scientific papers, plans for future research, peer reviews or communications with colleagues, physical objects, e.g. laboratory specimens, trade secrets, commercial information, materials necessary to be held confidential by research until they are published, or similar information which is protected under law, and personnel or medical information and similar information, the disclosure of which would constitute a clearly unwanted invasion of personal privacy. So there's several things that we all worry about in terms of having to make our data available that aren't included in the government definition of data. So the OSTP mandated to the funding agencies to perform a series of tasks by this August. And their plans are to include all these, I think there's 10 different things. But included in this is also recognizing proprietary interests and business confidential information and intellectual property rights. And I know that there was an opinion spoken earlier that no intellectual property rights should be granted for federally funded research, but I think that I personally think there's another point of view there, and that is that if you don't grant people who make the discovery the intellectual property rights and make it available for everyone, then no one can ever get a competitive edge by using that technology, and the chances of it being used are actually less than if it's protected and someone can get a technological edge by using that intellectual property. So We have to develop data management plans in digital form and long-term. Actually, we could explain why long-term preservation and access cannot be justified. And certainly, we've probably all taken data that you could argue that for. It allows inclusion for the appropriate cost for data management, although it doesn't really assess where that cost is going to come from. Ensure appropriate evaluation of the merits of submitted data management plans, and include mechanisms to ensure that intramural and extramural researchers comply. So this compliance is new, as Victoria pointed out, and there are talks about sort of $10,000 a day fines for not complying with these data sharing mandates. Promote the deposit of data in public accessible databases, encourage cooperation with the private sector, and this is also something that is clearly aimed at greater use of federally funded data for technological development, and develop approaches for identifying and providing appropriate attribution. And this is important for people who generate data that gets put up and used. You want to be able to be recognized for your contribution in producing that data. Support training for the analysis, preservation stewardess, provide the assessment of long-term needs for the preservation, and that's it. So I've sort of divided the rest of my talk into hopes and fears. And in terms of hopes, I talk about several things that can actually that are really wonderful about greater access to data. And the main thing from my point of view is that if I have greater access to data, it's going to speed up and assist in innovation. For an example, I don't know if you guys have, how many people have heard of the Materials Genome Initiative? So it's an initiative also spearheaded by the OSTP to I think it's got a terrible name because it really doesn't have anything to do with genomes. It's just a way to promote data sharing and more allowing more rapid development and implementation of new materials. And so there's a group at MIT and LBL that have established as part of this a database for 30,000 inorganic compounds. I mean, their idea is to say, look, there's a countable number of known inorganic compounds. Let's make a database of everything that's known about them so that if you want to know anything about one of these compounds, you can just look it up on the database. That's incredibly useful. And I'll give you an example. So in my group we're interested in forming oxynitrides. We have just started this, so I'm not going to show you the oxynitride we're working on, but for an example of an oxynitride, you could have this one here, where you start with an oxide and you react it to form a oxynitride. And these oxynitrides have unique and interesting properties for a variety of applications. And so this is a typical reaction one might use. And I have it in here because I don't think I've ever given a talk without an equation in it, so I'm not gonna start now. So we have a reaction-free energy for this equation. You can always write this reaction-free energy down. It has to do with the standard state reaction-free energy plus the RT of the log of the ratio of the pressures raised to the appropriate power, where the pressures are in atmospheres. And so then you set this equal to 0 to find equilibrium. And that can tell you under what conditions you're going to form this oxynitride. If you have a pressure of the products that's greater than that equilibrium pressure, you'll tend to drive the reaction to the right and vice versa. So by knowing these standard state free energies of the compounds and reactants and products, you can know under what conditions in your lab you're going to be forming the desired phase. Extremely useful. You can sit down look up in the database, find a few numbers, plug it in, and be on your way to doing an experiment that might take you weeks or months or several tries to do if you didn't have the ability to do this. So that's just a simple example of something that I think is going to enable a lot of more widespread discovery as people think of much more clever and complex ways to take advantage of large sets of data that are going to be there. So also sharing your data might increase the impact of the work that you do. So as a scientist, you always want to have people listen and care about your work. And so if you publish your data, there may be more people who can take advantage of your work and use it and increase its impact. So other researchers can discover aspects that you didn't study, that you weren't focusing on, but still is buried in your data. So now turning to fears for the academic researcher. In terms of use of archived data, one of the biggest fears is how can you be sure that the data you're using is any good? For example, when I go look up those standard state free energies of formation, how do I know they're right? And how are they codified? So, and also, if I were to look up someone else's experimental data, I would need a really well-documented set of metadata that described exactly the experiments that they did and the sample preparation. For example, I would want to know if the sample was grown in the substrate that was licked by my student's dog, for example, so that I could ignore that data or treat it accordingly. And you also have to have a way to develop trust in experimental or computational approach and skill. And this is, again, something that Victoria mentioned. So, you know, one thing we really have to ask ourselves is peer review of data sets realistic in today's time-constrained research environment? I mean, I know editors search high and low for reviewers of papers, and it's difficult, and I think it's become increasingly difficult as we've all become more and more busy. And now if we add to that the added role of peer reviewing the data set or the algorithms that are associated with that, we have to, I think, come up with new ways to recognize the contributions of peer reviewers. Because right now, I know that I don't think any evaluation that's done on me involves anything to do with what I review for and how good of a reviewer I am. So how can access to data be made clear, fast, and efficient? If it's out there but buried in a ton of junk and you can't find it, or when you do go looking for it, you find the number you want, but 10,000 other numbers that are not right or not appropriate or wrong. So we're going to need ways to search and visualize and come up with robust metrics for analyzing data. So in terms of archiving data issues, what does a researcher need? So you need a clear vision. I think we have to come up with a clear vision of what needs to be archived. So source data, all data, how far down on the data pyramid? So it turns out that sometimes it's useful to think of data in terms of a data pyramid where the data in a publication is the top, and supplemental data, archive data and data sets, and raw data and databases. And so how far down on this data pyramid do we need to archive? And some data sets are huge. Storing will represent a huge time and financial cost. I have a colleague who has a new camera on his transmission electron microscope. And he said this new camera will generate so much data I could swamp all recording ability for data in a very short amount of time. If I'm required to store every image that I ever take with this camera, I'll do one experiment a year and then spend the rest of the year archiving the data. And my data ate my grant, so we don't want that to happen. So we need an efficient approach for organizing data and metadata, so it's searchable and findable. We need a supported archive and a clear standard for credit for archived data. So when you put data up there and it's used by someone, you should get credit for it. Citations of stored data, can these be valued? How about co-inventor for discoveries? And we had touched upon this earlier in our panel discussion. And the ability to retain intellectual property. And again, I think this is important because if you make it available to everyone, there's a chance that no one will use it because they can't get a competitive edge from using it. And also, the PI needs to has to have gatekeeper power to reveal developing discoveries at the appropriate time. If you tell everyone what you're doing, which is my tendency to do, much to the chagrin of my graduate students sometimes, then other people can get a competitive edge on you. And it is, as much as I hate to think of it, a competitive business we're in. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is a survey that was done. And this survey was done by the Materials Research Society and TMS, which is the Minerals, Materials, and Metals Society, something like that. Anyhow, there's 3 M's. And they just published the preliminary results of this survey on the MRS webpage. So thanks to that I have. So there were 675 respondents from a wide variety of institutions, 47% academic, government, 12%. The positions they held were scientists, engineers, industry, university professors, and executive management, postdoctoral researchers, undergraduate and graduate students. And the areas in which they worked were experimentalist, applied and development, or computational. So, and theorists. Some of the answers we got were current use of software is 82%. We all use software. And for data analysis and data processing, or almost all of us, for data visualization and simulations. Many of us use databases. I mean, it's hard to believe that these numbers really aren't 100%. I mean, we can get by without them. Model validation and data mining and material selection, product engineering or design. So the types of data desired, people want physical and thermal property database, chemical property database, and a wide variety of other properties, including mechanical, electronic, and microstructures, et cetera. So what are the motivations people have to share data? 72% cited the increased visibility of their research. So they felt that sharing the data would help the research be more visible. 67% said they'd like to receive feedback on their data. And this comes up, brings back one issue that came up earlier, whether a paper, a publication could be, and a data set could be a living document where you incorporate feedback into the next version of the paper. And give opportunities to others to make discoveries. Impediments to sharing data. So a lot of people felt they had proprietary restricted nature of their data, intellectual property rules of their organization, data stored in a proprietary format, which seems like an overcomable problem. And the requirements for sharing data, 74% were willing to share the data if encouraged as a term or condition of funding. Metadata standards and protocols should be established. People felt they should. And some people felt they should be standard, and some felt they should be community-driven. So there was a conflict there. And what data to share? So some said all data, including data not used for publications, only released, and about an equal number said only data for publication. And some people said supporting data only or situation dependent, et cetera. To ensure reproducible data, people felt that there were some actions needed to ensure a complete description of experimental and computational details, establish standards and guidelines, expand experimental and modeling sections of papers, for example, and verify data via peer review. And again, this issue of code. Reproducibility. And I will say, just in closing, that there was a wide spectrum of opinions expressed about this move to share data, ranging from an enthusiastic embrace to passionate objection. You know, one person even saying that my data is my product, just like steel or paper would be a product for a steel or paper maker, and you're telling me to give my product away is the same as telling them to give their steel away. So there's a lot of strong opinions about this, and it'll be interesting to see how they evolve as time goes on. So with that, I want to close with an acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge the MRS for giving me what insight I do have in this area through the workshops I've worked with as the president last year and the past president this year, and working with Todd Usman and Eileen, who's also here today, who's going to be participating in the panel this afternoon, and Ron Kelly, who works with us in Washington. And for TMS for sharing the survey results. And since I'm standing up here as a speaker, I'm also going to put on my hat as co-organizers and thank my co-organizers, Tom and Bob, and Amy and Julie for their excellent work, and Bob Schwarzenwalder as well, and in particular Sarah for doing just an amazing job in putting this together in short order without ever seeming like she was harried, but somehow getting everything done. And I also want to thank our sponsors. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions if there are some.
Bruce, I think we're going to save questions for you for the panel since we're running a little bit behind, and we'll move on